Hello, America. My name is Dylan John, and you are listening to Nature and the Nation. For today's episode, I will be returning once again to History of Political Philosophy, edited by Leo Strauss and Joseph Cropsey. The particular essay that I want to focus on is Immanuel Kant. Every essay in this book focuses on a different political thinker. Today, we're going to look at Kant. I've kind of delayed examining Kant because from what I know of him, from what I've read about him in various other books, I don't know as though I agree with much of anything that he says. Although I have to admit, as time has passed, I've learned a little bit more about what he thinks, and I've also evolved in my own ideas a little bit, and my curiosity about what Kant has to say has grown. I was very opposed to his idea of a priori ideas, or whatever it is that he proposes as a priori concepts. But I've grown a little bit more open to the idea, and I've grown to understand a little bit more about his ideas of practical wisdom. I've never read Kant, I have to confess. I don't think I ever will, unless something changes in my direction. I think I'm content to read a bit about Kant, understand a little bit about Kant, and go from there. Because what I really want, there's just so many books in so little time. I can't read all of the books. I can't even read all of the philosophers. There are so many, and there's so much that has been written. And especially if I'm also trying to read about mythology and politics and psychology and sociology, I have to trim the fat somewhere, as some things just won't get read, and Kant is probably one of them. But I do want to know about Kant because so much of philosophy is a response to Kant. He actually is a very important figure. His importance alone drives me to feel like I want to read about him and possibly even read Kant, just for the sheer fact that he is such an important figure in Western philosophy. But to start with, I'm just going to read about Kant, and this is where I'm going to begin. This essay focuses on his politics, since this is a history of political philosophy and not just a history of philosophy. With every thinker in this book, it focuses on the political aspects of what that thinker has to say. And this section is no different. And I think that I disagree with most of what I read here about what Kant believes. Although I think maybe there's bits and pieces I can pull out and say, yeah, that looks correct. I would say for the most part, I disagree with most of the things that this essay presents Kant as believing. Like all my episodes, I'm going to read a couple sections. I think I'm going to jump in here very early in the essay to start reading about his Kant's separation between morality and nature. And I would suppose that this is, from the get-go, the very first section I disagree with. I think that our morality and our nature are bound together inexorably. And his proposal for the separation of these two things seems like he's off on the wrong foot from the start. Nevertheless, he says, quote, Kant's political teaching may be summarized in a phrase: Republican government and international organization. In more characteristically Kantian terms, it is a doctrine of the state based upon law and of eternal peace. Indeed, in each of these formulations, both terms express the same idea, that of legal constitution or of peace through law. Within and among states, it is a matter of passing from the state of nature, which is a state of war, to the lawful state, which is a state of peace. The definition of the lawful state, and above all, the foundations on which it rests, and the conditions that compel its coming into being, are the objects of Kant's effort so far as he is a political philosopher. He performs his task by drawing on the conceptions of morality and history, showing the dependence of peace on law and of law on reason, and the drive in the nature of things toward a free, rational, and thus peaceable state. Kant's enterprise might be said to have as its point of departure the tension between science and morality, between modern physics, most systematically developed by Newton, and the moral conscience, most purely expressed by Rousseau, between the universal determinism implied by the former and the freedom of will implied by the latter. Kant seeks to resolve the problem by radicalizing it. He seeks to preserve the two terms not by reconciling them, but by giving their tension and their coexistence a theoretical basis, namely, the articulation of the opposition between nature and freedom, between the world of phenomena and the world of noumena. The world of phenomena is the world of things in their manifestation or appearance. The world of noumena is the world of things as they are in themselves, or as they might be known if knowledge of them could be had without the mediation of experience. The world of phenomena is what science can know. The world of noumena is the realm which is opened up by morality. It is in this latter realm that reason attains perfect freedom from the conditioning and thus limiting effect of the natural world of things. Precisely in this realm of unconditioned reason can men be free of every external thing, of every object of doing, making, or acquiring. Left to them is perfect autonomy, freedom to obey a self-prescribed law, out of pure respect for the universality or impartiality of law itself. The complete disjunction of the empirical from the noumenal entails an equally complete disjunction of happiness and virtue. Happiness is the satisfaction of our empirical, natural inclinations, while virtue is obedience to the moral law. The one belongs to the order of nature, the other to the order of freedom. But Kant cannot leave matters at the absolute disjunction of the two realms. An accord must be procured between virtue and happiness, so that freedom can operate within nature, and nature be receptive to moral action, even to be transformed by it. Kant achieves this accord by raising the question, for what can man hope? And then showing that the answer lies in two directions. What can be hoped in this life, thus drawing into consideration the realm of phenomena, and what can be hoped hereafter. In order to show what we can hope in the next world, Kant elaborates the postulates of practical reason, existence of God, and immortality of the soul. His discussions of law, politics, and historical teleology enable him to show what man can hope for here on earth. Having separated the two realms of morality and nature, Kant tries to reunite them by producing intermediaries and correspondences between them. Law, history, and politics appear as the composite criterion for evaluating that reunion. The evaluation, and thus the criterion, are of singular importance, for the question of the relation between the realms of nature and morality is in fact the question of the possible existence of the two realms, the conceptions of which are the products of a freedom and a reason at work in the phenomenal world. The root of the question raised by Kant's political philosophy resides in the ambiguity of morality and politics, each in itself and the two in their mutual relation. That ambiguity makes Kant's own formula that true politics is the application of his morality acceptable only with some refinement. The difficulty arises because it is true not only that Kant's politics must be understood on the basis of his morality, but his morality may be understood on the basis of his politics. Moreover, his politics must also be understood independently of his morality, and his morality ultimately depends radically on conditions that lie beyond politics. This ambiguity or contradiction explains both Kant's division and reunion of law and morality, and his strange hesitation on the threshold of philosophy of history while apparently according it a place both decisive and tangential. End quote. Okay, you could see from the get-go there, some of this is a little bit hard to wrap your head around. This is only the very beginning of the essay, and he's already introducing an awful lot. But he's talking here about the separation between morality and nature. And he says, to start off with, that his political philosophy can be summarized in a phrase: Republican government and international organization. And in trying to get a little bit more out of that, he says this is a doctrine of the state based on law and of eternal peace. So there are two things: a state based upon law and eternal peace. Those are the two doctrines of Kant's political teachings, and he says those are expressing the same idea: peace through law. Legal constitution and peace through law are the same concept in different terms. And he says that within and among states, so not just within a single state, not just a single state passing from a state of nature into a state of law, a state of peace, stepping out of the state of nature into a state of peace and a state of law, but also between states. So an international law, international organization, and the complete banishment of the state of war / the state of nature, and the total global triumph of the state of law and the state of peace. That's his objective. And, it makes sense when you think in terms of philosophy and ideology and metaphysics. It's all conceptual. It's all a conceptual realm. And you could say like the domain of metaphysics is the same for all people in all different places, and ideologies can apply. You could have capitalism all over the world. You could have communism all over the world. Ideologies don't know or respect national boundaries or national identities. They don't really have any particular reason to, unless it's explicitly baked into the ideology, like an ideology of nationalism. But even then, you would say that, you want the whole world to adopt this ideology of nationalism. Ideologies have these ways of being universalized. So it goes without saying that his adoption of peace through law within the state should also apply to peace through law among states. But he says that the point of departure for Kant's enterprise is this tension between science and morality. If we're going to get down to like where his philosophy really comes from, the conflict between science and morality. Now, how much is that the source of Kant's entire philosophy or just his morality? I don't know, but his morality / politics has at its point of departure, according to the author here, who is, by the way, Pierre Hassner, who wrote this particular essay. According to the author, this begins with the tension between science and morality, and he goes on to develop this idea. He says that the science is kind of Newton is the characteristic originator of the science and law and deterministic, structural, organizational, mechanistic universe of Newton, and the moral conscience of Rousseau. So he says there's a conflict between universal determinism, implied by the former, freedom of will, implied by the latter being Rousseau, the former being Newton. So there's this problem of determinism, of science, and the freedom of will of Rousseau, and the kind of romantic freedom of will. To try to reconcile these things together is Kant's project. And rather than trying to reconcile them, what he does is he tries to instead provide a justification and an explanation for their separation. He accepts the separation of these two things. He kind of accepts a duality of the world in that way. And he says, like, we've got, the world of phenomena. That's the world of the things we experience and see, our empirical experiences. That's the world that science studies observations. This is the world of nature and the world of science. Then there's the world of noumena, which is things as they are in themselves, as they might be known, if knowledge could be had without the mediation of experience. The world of phenomena is what science can know, and the world of noumena is the realm which is opened up by morality. So things as they actually are and not as they appear is where the domain of morality arises, interestingly. Now, the realm of noumena, the realm of morality, is the realm that is separated from the realm of phenomena. So as soon as you say there's the world of things that you see, and then there's the world of things as they are, you begin to separate these two things, and you begin to create a dichotomy between them and an opposition between them. such that the things that you see is not really the way things really are. And so in order to understand the way things really are, you have to leave the world of phenomena, step away from the things that you see. And what's left over is pure reason and rationality. It's the pure mind, pure rational mind of law, right? Law unparticular, unattached to actual circumstances, but a deeper, more prior, basic law that has no real point of connection with tangible affairs in its most pure form. He says, precisely in this realm of unconditioned reason can men be free of every external thing, of every object of doing, making, or acquiring. Left to them is perfect autonomy, freedom to obey a self-prescribed law out of pure respect for the universality or impartiality of law itself. So the domain of noumena, he identifies as the domain of morality and also as the domain of sort of pure law. So morality and pure law get bound up together in this separate realm from the realm of things that you see and observe. And happiness is acquired through sensations, phenomena. Your happiness happens in the world of phenomena. And your virtue, on the other hand, lies in the realm of noumena. Your virtue lies in adhering to moral law regardless of particular circumstances. And so now he says an accord must be procured between virtue and happiness so that freedom can operate within nature, right? The freedom of pure will. It's weird. It's like this pure freedom and pure law kind of bound up together in the realm of noumena. It's wrapped up in both of these things. But he says virtue is obedience to the moral law, so there's freedom, but it's the freedom to be obedient. He says Kant can't leave matters at the absolute disjunction of the two realms. An accord must be procured between virtue and happiness so that freedom can operate within nature, and nature be receptive to moral action, or even to be transformed by it. So that's his goal, is to connect these things together. Nature must be receptive to morality, and morality must be able to operate, have the capacity to operate within nature. And then he breaks it down between what you're hoping for in this life and what you're hoping for in the next life. So that the things that happen in this life are all bound up in your happiness, and all your virtue is rewarded in the next life. Your virtue is tied up with your next life. And so the existence of God and the immortality of the soul are the basic fundamental premises required for that sort of connection to a virtue that's not our embrace of virtue that's not rewarded in this world. So that's really like the cause of the split. He says, because as I said, he's not trying to reconcile really science and morality. He goes in the opposite direction and splits them, builds a foundation for them, and that foundation lies here, right? The separation between what you're hoping for in this life and what you're hoping for in the afterlife. So the whole premise is built on immortality of the soul and the existence of God. Those are like basic postulates. And then it starts to jumble into nonsense a little bit, where he says, okay, so Kant tries to reunite these two realms of morality and nature by producing intermediaries and correspondences between them, law, history, and politics. These are so like institutions, modes of being of humans, the things that we do, the politics and everything else, the things that we do act as intermediaries between these two realms of morality and nature. They connect with one another in our behaviors. Now he says the root of the question raised by Kant's political philosophy resides in the ambiguity of morality and politics, each in relation to itself and the two in their mutual relation. The ambiguity makes Kant's own formula that the true politics is the application of his morality. So what seems ambiguous is the connection between these two utterly distinct realms. At the same, he's kind of doing two things at once. He's clarifying the distinction between these two realms, and then he's specifying that the two realms interact with one another But there's an ambiguity introduced, and where is the ambiguity located? He almost says that ambiguity located is in morality itself, not just morality's interaction with the phenomenal world through the act of politics. And I'm perfectly willing to accept the existence of ambiguity in this sort of area, but I think there's enough ambiguity all around to call into question his separation of the two realms of phenomena and noumena in the first place. I think there's ambiguity right from the very beginning of his proposal. Anyway, I'm going to jump forward to the next section. He starts talking more about the moral nature of politics, and he says, quote, Kant repeatedly acknowledges Rousseau's decisive influence on his political and moral doctrines. The priority of the practical over the theoretical, of the moral over the intellectual, the superiority to the scientists or philosophers as such, of simple souls, obedient to the voice of duty, all proceed from the Rousseau of the first discourse and of the profession of faith of the Savoyard-Vicar. Just as the notions of liberty as obedience to self-prescribed law and of the generalization of particular desires as guaranteeing their legality are taken ultimately from the teaching of Rousseau in the social contract. Finally, Kant's philosophy of history is oriented explicitly upon Rousseau's discourse on the origin of inequality. To perceive the Rousseauism of Kant's morality is to perceive immediately the political inspiration of that morality. But at the same time, Kant's radicalization of Rousseauism, his transformation of the generalization of desires or wills into the universalization of maxims, and the consequences he draws from it in his doctrine of postulates, produce a morality both apolitical and inapplicable to politics. Whether Kant's morality is political and whether it needs or depends upon politics are questions that can be asked with a view to the sources or inspiration, the content, and the application or consequences of that morality. We cannot avoid asking also whether Kant's politics is moral, that is, whether it depends in every respect on the ethic of the practical reason. Thus, perpetual peace is held out as the supreme political good, because, indeed, the practical reason absolutely forbids war. But peace is shown also in the manner of Hobbes and Locke as indispensable to life and property, that is, good for the sake of some end, or happiness in the realm of nature, or unfreedom. Also, the state of civil society has a moral content, because it is the state of that respect for rights, which is the basis of freedom and human dignity. But while philosophy of history appeals to the working of a good will, a moral will, for the bringing into being of the truly civil state, Kant recognizes that nature forces the progress toward that state to depend upon passion, discord, and war. Again, the idea of a true republican government can occur only to a moral politician, a man who thoroughly subordinates politics to morals, and for whom the attainment of eternal peace is not merely a technical, but a truly moral task. At the same time, not only does republican government not presuppose perfection in its citizens, but the establishment of civil society in general is possible among devils if only they be intelligent. Morality and politics thus appear sometimes to converge, sometimes to exist on different planes altogether. We may anticipate our conclusions so far as to say that what makes this problem difficult and interesting with respect to Kantianism, and Kantianism in turn with respect to political philosophy, is that from a single source arise not only the rigorous and solid foundations, but also the disjunction of morality and politics. While the political importance of this system rests above all on its power to approximate the two to each other. It is true that the disjunction of the two worlds is more convincing than the reconciliation. The purity of the soul and the hope for its indefinite progress in another world are more essential to morality than are republican government and indefinite progress in this world toward perpetual peace. And conversely, the problem of civil society referred more effectually to the demands of happiness and security than of morality. Yet it is also true that Kant is uniquely important not only to philosophy, but to the political conscience, precisely for the political consequences of his moral teaching and the moral dimension of his political teaching. He invests certain moral themes with a direct political bearing, and political themes with a sacred moral dignity. Anyone who seriously considers the basis of liberalism and democracy will discover a moral sentiment therein that is absent in Hobbes and Locke, and even in Rousseau, but given a theoretical support by Kant. End quote. Okay, so what do we have in this section? Jumping to the very end there, he says that Kant is important to political philosophy and to the political conscience because of the political consequences of his moral teaching and the moral dimensions of his politics. The way that he blends these two worlds, the world of politics, which is the world of within the world of phenomena, within the world of nature, and the world of morality, the way he blends these things together has a direct bearing on modern liberalism. He says he invests certain moral themes with a direct political bearing and political themes with a sacred moral dignity. Politics and morality get wrapped up together in Kant. He makes so much of the need to reconcile them with one another that it becomes an important question and an important component of liberalism. Anyone who seriously considers the basis of liberalism and democracy will discover a moral sentiment therein that is absent in Hobbes and Locke and even Rousseau, but given theoretical support by Kant. In a way, Kant it could be seen as like almost the father of liberalism. That the first stirrings came about in Locke and Hobbes, but Kant bound up politics and morality in a way that has been carried through liberalism ever since. What else does he say in here? Well, he does talk about how influenced by Rousseau Kant was. And he does make he talks a little bit about the discord and the perhaps even incoherence, the conflict or contradiction, perhaps, that lies in a lot of Kant's political and moral work, where he says, while philosophy of history appeals to the working of a good will or a moral will for the bringing into being of the truly civil state, the bringing into being of the truly civil state, he says Kant recognizes that nature forces the progress toward that state to depend upon passion, discord, and war. So they're sort of bound up together, and we depend upon those things that we're trying to banish. Discord, war, the sort of conflict, the sort of things that we want to banish from the civil state are also dependent. The civil state is dependent upon those things for its coming into being. I don't know. I mean, maybe it's just me. I feel like there's a bit of a discord or contradiction that runs through all of Kant's work because he's postulating a radical break between things that clearly are not radically separated from one another. And then he twists himself into knots, trying to find ways to reassemble them. But he has to admit the ambiguity of it all, and he can't reassemble them in a way that is totally coherent because he's broken them apart at all of the points where they're naturally held together. And I think that his placement of morality in the realm of noumena rather than the realm of phenomena is probably the core of his problem. But that, I suppose, is religion. That's what religion demands. And Kant is carrying a lot of religious ideas with him into his philosophy. Anyway, continuing on to where he discusses the rights of man, he says, quote, Kant's enterprise on behalf of the rights of man expresses itself in an intention to establish unconditionally a moral foundation for political liberty and equality, or to free men by enlightening them about their rights, disclosing to all of them that the freedom to legislate is the only legitimate basis for the obedience of the subject. For a better understanding, we consider the relationship of Kant to Rousseau and Hume, who, according to Kant, provided the point of departure for his philosophy and decisively motivated him to undertake such an enterprise. Kant has recorded the powerful effect that Rousseau had upon him. I am myself by inclination a researcher. I feel in fullest measure the thirst for knowledge and the greedy desire to progress in it, as well as satisfaction at every advance. There was a time when I believed this alone could constitute the honor of mankind, and I despised the vulgar, which knows of nothing. Rousseau brought me into the right shape. That illusory distinction vanishes. I learn to respect human beings, and I should consider myself more useless than the common working man if I did not believe that this consideration could give a value to all others by establishing the rights of man. As for Hume, Kant wrote, I readily confess that the animadversions of David Hume were what first interrupted my dogmatic slumber many years ago, and gave my investigations in speculative philosophy an entirely altered direction. Rousseau's was the affirmative inspiration upon which Kant oriented his own conception of human worth and of the task of philosophy. And that worth and that task have a direct imperative political bearing. From Rousseau, Kant adopts the primacy of morality over philosophy, of action over contemplation, of practical over theoretical reason. The thought that the primacy of morality entails the equal worth of all men, and the thought that morality and the recognition of the rights of man substantively coincide. But the primacy of action over contemplation implies the primacy of freedom over nature. The primacy of practical reason implies the critique of theoretical reason, that is, of both science and metaphysics. Hume's skepticism had rendered questionable both science and metaphysics, and thus awakened Kant from his dogmatic slumber. Kant had to disinter the true rational foundations of science, and thus to show its limitations, and thus to put the rejection of theoretical metaphysics on a solid foundation. Hume had maintained that the fundamental notions, necessity and causality, are validated for us by experience and convenience, not by reason. Kant accepted Hume's negative judgment on the dogmatism of prevailing thought, that is, his criticisms of the philosophers' failure to consider the possible tenuousness of their most fundamental notions. But he rejected the positive part of Hume's doctrine, its empiricism. Kant demanded that the principles that support our understanding, especially causation, be better founded than upon mere experience, lest their necessity and their universality become unintelligible, and the possibility of science, particularly mathematical physics, thus be lost. Kant states the problem by means of the distinction between analytic and synthetic judgments. Analytic judgments are those in which the subject itself contains or implies the predicate perfectly, such that the predicate merely explicates something already said when the subject was uttered, and does not produce any new knowledge. The validity of analytic judgments is therefore independent of experience. Such judgments are a priori. Synthetic judgments are those in which the predicate does add something to what the thinker of the judgment can have in mind in uttering the subject itself. Judgments based on experience are necessarily synthetic. They are synthetic judgments a posteriori. But experience as such is not possible if there are not synthetic judgments a priori, judgments of apodictic necessity and universal validity, hence incapable of being validated by experience. For instance, all experience presupposes the principle of causality, which, as Hume has shown, is not analytical, and which, as Hume had failed to see, cannot be derivative from experience, since it is a presupposition of all possible experience. But causality is not the only principle of this kind. There is a whole system of categories and the forms of pure intuition, space and time. The cooperation of the categories and the forms of pure intuition supplies the framework that renders possible the science of nature. Science of nature, that is, of the phenomenal world, is thus not a contemplation of a reality existent outside ourselves, but is rather the laying down of law to nature by ourselves, the investing of things by ourselves with that which alone we can know about them a priori. Science of nature is fundamentally the spontaneous product of the understanding, as distinguished from the receptivity, of the senses. It is the practical reason that permits us to participate in the intelligible world, to escape at the same time the passivity of mere contemplation and the empirical relativity of the phenomenal world, that world to which the theoretical reason is limited. The ascent from determinacy toward spontaneity is achieved by the discovery of the freedom of the practical reason. The ascent from determinacy toward spontaneity is achieved by the discovery of the freedom of the practical reason. That freedom finds its culmination in the freedom of the moral man, or in morality proper." End quote. All right, so that was a challenging section. He starts off talking about the rights of man, but he gets this from he kind of goes off into a tangent about where Kant gets his ideas from Hume and from Rousseau, and Rousseau was largely the source of his morality, and Hume originated his more epistemological thoughts. But he oddly he agrees with Hume about some basics, and perhaps some of Hume's skepticism about the dogmatism of prevailing thought and fundamental presuppositions of philosophy, and his questioning of causation and such. His questioning of some of the ability of philosophers to reason out their ideas. But Kant breaks with Hume when Hume says, well, we understand things like causation and necessity, not because we've reasoned our way to them, but because we've always experienced them. Empirically, we see that it always happens a certain way, and custom and habit have led us to simply accept that this is the way things are, because we've observed it to always be that way. And expecting that it's going to continue to be the way that it has always been is a habit of ours. And it's a habit that served us well, and thus we continue to behave that way. But we don't really know things will continue to be the way they were. And so we're basing our trust on observation. And Kant says, actually, we're not really basing our trust on observation, because we have hardwired, I suppose, a priori ideas about causation and about space and time forms, and our what he calls our pure intuition, our intuitions that we're in a three-dimensional world, that we're within a time stream, that there are some things that happened, and then there's things that are happening, and then there's things that will happen. Our presence in space and time is presupposed. This is an a priori idea. And I begin to think that there's really an awful lot to this. It sounds to me like common sense. It sounds like Thomas Reid and Scottish common sense philosophy a little bit. The same sort of agreement with parts of Hume, but then disagreement with parts of Hume. That instead of habit and custom, it's really like an inner knowing, a concept that we begin with from the get-go, we're born with, and those concepts form the foundation of our philosophy. Our philosophy is dependent on the basic premises of common sense. We can't work backwards and reason our way to these fundamental premises. We just know them because there's no other way to interact with reality unless we accept them as being true. So I feel like there's a connection here between Kant and common sense philosophy, which was a little surprising to me. The more I learned about Kant, I thought he would be in more strict opposition to common sense, and actually he is. He criticizes Thomas Reid and common sense philosophy, but I think there's maybe more connection there than Kant was willing to admit, perhaps. Anyhow, continuing on from there, he talks about goodwill. And this is, I think, where I begin to diverge with Kant. Goodwill is just, it's if you do something bad, but you have good intentions. To me, that doesn't count for all that much. Maybe it counts for something, but I'm much more concerned with the consequences of things than whatever the validity of the ideology that prompted them, or the moral intentions of the person who initiated them. I'm much more concerned with how things turn out in the end, that they should be judged by consequences. And that's my inclination toward pragmatism. And I think inclination toward what someone's intentions are in the first place is almost the polar opposite of pragmatism. And I think that's where I disagree most specifically with Kant. So here he says, quote, "The primacy of practical reason has a twofold consequence. It brings relief from the unknowability of the world as it is in itself by giving all men equally access to the deepest truth, which is the moral truth, and through the continuous challenging of the merely empirical world by practical reason, leads to the emancipation of men's moral and political formulations from the experience of the past. With regard to nature, it is experience, no doubt, that supplies us with rules and is the source of all truth. With regard to moral laws, on the other hand, experience is, alas, but the source of illusion, and it is altogether reprehensible to derive or limit the laws of what we ought to do by our experience of what has been done. The new conception of reason moves, through the primacy of practice, to the radical distinction between the is and the ought, a distinction present in Hume but elaborated first by Kant, and thence to moral formalism and political and legal doctrinarism. The rights of man are to be known a priori, valid and demanded universally. They can have, as source and content, only that radical liberty which is linked to the essence of the rational being as such. And this liberty is independent of the nature of the cosmos, of man, and of society. It cannot be defined in terms of the achievement of ends, nor applied in terms of determined or determining circumstances. The critique of theoretical reason, which Hume had begun, opens the way for a radical liberation of man, by eliminating everything that could impose laws on liberty outside of liberty itself. It is to Rousseau's influence that Kant owes the origin and the moral and political consequences of this liberation, the true point of departure and the true destination of his enterprise. There is an echo of this influence in the famous sentence which opens section 1 of Kant's Fundamental Principles of the Metaphysics of Morals. Nothing can possibly be conceived in the world, or even out of it, which can be called good, without qualification, except a good will. The virtues themselves are not simply good, for they can be put to corrupt use by a bad will. Morality is not for the sake of happiness, or the perfection of man's nature. On the contrary, it is morality that gives value to that happiness and that perfection. Conversely, the goodness of the good will is in no way validated by the achievement of the will's desired end, nor diminished by its failure to achieve its end. We can now begin to perceive the characteristic two-sidedness of Kant's moral and political teaching, its demand for both obedience and emancipation, for both submitting and glorying in liberty. For morality, or the good will, consists in acting not merely conformably to the law, but out of respect for law, to which it renders absolute obedience. But since that law is an expression of the subject's autonomy, it stands not for an external authority, but for his own will. The good will, as good in itself independently of any effect it might have, and as constituting in itself the highest good, in some measure replaces God or nature. Men who vaunt their intelligence or their happiness are depreciated. It is the humble individual who submits to law, to the utmost, that man as such is raised, through goodness of will, to an unprecedented sovereignty. This revolutionary doctrine of the priority and substance of morality has various political implications. First and most obvious, it powerfully supports the belief in human equality, disparaging the various natural and social empirical sources of inequality, and maintaining that a man's distinction depends only on his quality as a moral being. But every man can have a good will, the one thing needful and the only thing good in itself. Hence follows the equality of all men and the decisive respect and their absolute value to be respected by all in each. Not only hereditary rank, but every abasement of one man by or before another is an offense against the equality and autonomy of man. End quote. So here we get the section on goodwill, and we begin to look more at the rights of man, and here's where, like I said, I begin to break from what Kant is saying, because from the very beginning, we get back to the separation between nature and morality, and he includes a quote from Kant that says, "With regard to nature, it's experience that supplies us with rules, and it's the source of all truth. With regard to morals, on the other hand, experience is the source of illusion. We should not, he says, it's reprehensible to derive or limit the laws of what we ought to do by experience. So in the terms of morality, we should absolutely not look to experience. But in terms of nature, that's the prime source for knowledge. So we're not after experience when it comes to morality. And again, we get our separation between the is and the ought. And when it comes to the ought, it's not derived from experience. He says the rights of man are to be known a priori, valid and demandable universally. Now, in some sense, I want to say, okay, we do have some sort of moral sensibility hardwired into us, and obeying our own moral inclinations could be a sort of a priori sense of the rights of other people. Other people have the right not to be abused. We might say innocent people shouldn't be harmed for no reason. We have a sort of inborn sense of morality that doesn't necessarily have to be taught to us. But how strong is that? And can that be relied upon entirely to guide our moral code? Should we really say that experience has no hand in what our morals should be? And this can really spiral out of control because you can't really prove the a priori things, right? That's what makes them a priori. Like when you talk about an intuition of our presence in space and time, certain common sense intuitions that form the foundations of our sciences, form the foundations of our knowledge about the world, our intuition that we're not just brains in a vat. They almost by being a priori, it's a question of, it's a question in a sense, it's a question of before what? Is it pre-rational or is it pre-empirical? Because those aren't really the same things. It's something you know before you've observed it. Is it something that you know without having to reason your way to it? If it's something you know before you've observed it, then it's maybe the product of some sort of reason. It's a priori, and yet it's still bound up in reason. Or is it underlying reason? Is it prior to reason? In which case, no justification can be created, can be crafted or presented for it. And in some sense, you might just have to accept it. And here we can get ourselves bound up in dogma. So it doesn't need to be explained. It doesn't need to be proven. It doesn't need to be justified. It just is because we said so, because it is a priori, it is behind, underlying, it is more fundamental than reason. It can't be reasoned to, right? We just have to accept it. It can be, the whole concept of a priori can be used as a justification for dogma. And in a sense, I think Kant opens the doors to liberal dogmatism. The rights of man are unquestionable. They are self-evident. We hold these truths to be self-evident. The rights of man are self-evident, meaning they are before reason. They're unable to be reasoned to. They just exist. The source of liberal dogmatism, I think, draws a line right back to Kant. And I think that's where I disagree with him. And I disagree with a lot of the ideas of natural law or first principles or a priori concepts, because again, anything can get thrown in there. We wind up with all the dignity of all man and the equality of all people starts to come up in there as well. The autonomy of all people, the freedom of all people from having to be influenced by anything, anywhere. Is this some sort of self-evident right of all people to absolute autonomy? But really, you can fit an awful lot into that self-evident bucket. Anyway, continuing on from there to talk about human dignity, he says, quote, "Every man is entitled to respect from every other man, and in return owes all of them respect. Humanity itself is dignity, meaning that a man cannot be treated, even by himself, as a means, but always and only as an end. His dignity consists precisely in this, and he has the obligation to recognize and practice this dignity in respect of all men. I cannot deny a depraved man all the respect which, at least in his capacity as a man, cannot be taken away from him, and this is so even though his actions make him unworthy of it. The reproaches and the condemnations provoked by vice, deserved though they may be and inseparable from one's silent contempt for the individual in question, must never lead to complete contempt for the depraved man, nor to the denial of all moral worth to him, for he would then be supposed unable ever to improve himself, which cannot be reconciled with the idea of man who, as such, as a moral being, can never lose every inclination toward what is good. The dignity that belongs only to the moral man imposes precisely on him the duty of treating all men with a certain respect. For the dignity of the moral man in action redounds upon the species, upon all potentially moral men, possessors of an inclination to good which, wicked as they might be, distinguishes them from the beasts and assimilates them to moral man. Men are not equal in dignity, but one has the duty to treat them as though they were. The right of the individual to be treated as an equal, or at least to see certain aspects of his dignity respected, is not based on his being equal or respectable, but on the duty to treat all men as equal or respectable. It is based less on the primacy than on the content of morality. If respect for the rights of man is based on morality, it is so because morality is defined as respect for the rights of man. The content of morality appears as a deduction a priori from universality as the form of morality. The line of moral formalism comes close to defining the political horizon in a conceptual world dominated by the ideas of universalization, of rational mankind as an end in itself, of the kingdom of ends, and of autonomy. The moral worth of an action proceeds from the goodness of the will by which that action is animated, which in turn means the purity of that will, the goodness of the will in its abstraction from every empirical end. Purity of will implies purification of the will of all substantive intention, the animation of the will only by its self-respect, its respect for the formal principle of will in general, in other words, respect for law as such. Duty itself means the necessity of performing an action out of respect for law. But how does the moral man find the law that is to govern every action of his life? How does a man of good will recognize his duty? Kant's criterion for the good will proves to be universalization, as Rousseau's criterion for the general will was generalization. Kant's criterion requires a man, on the point of acting, to ask himself whether the maxim governing his intended action, for example, the greatness of my need justifies this departure from honesty, could become the universal law of action for all men without destroying the act itself. For example, a man needing a loan realizes that he will never be able to repay it. Should he promise to do so nonetheless? If all men would promise to repay, even when knowing themselves unable to fulfill their promises, promises would become universally nugatory. His false promise, if universalized, would abolish promises, and would also abolish the very borrowing that is the aim of the promise. A self-contradicting or irrational rule cannot be the law for a rational being. It follows that a man should not make a promise that he expects not to fulfill. That a man should act only according to the criterion of his action's universalizability is called by Kant the categorical imperative, the imperative that binds categorically or universally, not merely hypothetically or with a view to certain circumstances, needs or ends connected with the action. Act so that the maxim of your action might be elevated by your will to be a universal law of nature. There is only one categorical imperative, and that is the imperative of universality. End quote Okay, here we get a pretty important concept of the categorical imperative. And also he talks about human dignity, as I said. And he gives dignity to all men, even a depraved person. He says, I cannot deprive a depraved man all the respect. This is him quoting Kant. I cannot deny a depraved man all the respect which, at least in his capacity as a man, cannot be taken away from him. So that all, and I think that this goes too far. This takes the concept too far. A person who has committed vile deeds, vile crimes, has lost their right to human dignity. I think that at a certain point, punishment for certain depraved deeds must disregard human rights and must disregard dignity and must achieve a bit of brutality in order to serve its role as disincentive. I don't think that the preservation of human rights is the highest good. There may be something that we could consider higher right. We could consider human rights, but our dedication to these human rights is not absolute. I don't know why it should be. We have to remember what our dedication is to, and as living beings, our dedication first and foremost is to, of course, say it with me, the replication of the genetic code. That is why we're here. So we can recognize, or we can, let us say, invent something we'll call human rights, which is a postulate that's based upon admittedly a priori moral sensations, hardwired moral sensations that are of a rather vague and undefined nature. But those moral sensations are complex, and we also naturally feel an intuition that if a person has done a vile deed, our intuition says this person need not be treated with kid gloves in the same way that someone who is more innocent should be treated. We don't treat all people the same. We don't treat all people equally. And our morality doesn't demand that even though people, and it sort of says in this section, even though people aren't equal, our duty is to treat them as if they were. I think that our own a priori hardwired morality tells us otherwise. And the minute we try to make a universal law out of something that finds its origin in our sensations within particular given circumstances, we begin to distort things to try to make them into laws. The law of universality, the categorical imperative, a certain code that we must always honor. We lose the particularity of circumstances. Morality is created by our moral intuitions running up against the world. And those moral intuitions have at their core the true aim of genetic replication. That's how we've evolved to have those moral codes. But trying to extrapolate out of some particular aspect of our morality, a universal law by which all people must behave, I think that's like the number one problem Kant has. That's his number one failure, his attempt to systematize and organize, despite the fact that he goes through and says, yes, it's ambiguous, yes, it's different than the laws of nature, but his attempt to systematize it and craft laws, trying to bind up pure law with morality, that alone, I think, creates distortions. And I think that's what I disagree with most in Kant. So I'm going to wrap it up right there with the categorical imperative. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll talk to you again next time.